Good afternoon. Today, we're going to provide a cybersecurity risk assessment from New Zealand's perspective. We will go over the following topics throughout this risk assessment: the problem statement, current defensive measures, attack vectors, security weaknesses, risk assessment, mitigation recommendations, and industry best practices. The scope of this risk assessment report is to evaluate risks to New Zealand's network after identifying anomalous activity associated with data exfiltration. The New Zealand CISO contacted our cyber team hours before the Global Economic Summit and informed us that the secure communications network has been compromised by a denial of service attack. A DOS attack is a malicious attempt to disrupt the normal traffic of a targeted server, service, or network by overwhelming the target with a flood of internet traffic. As a team, we must determine how to remediate the system. The other members of the Five Eye Alliance are also affected by this cyber attack. While it is believed that China or Russia are responsible for the attack, everybody is still under suspicion, even members of the Five Eye Alliance. New Zealand's current defensive measures consist of multi-factor authentication, which can be a combination of something you know, something you have, and something you are. To gain access to our systems, analysts must have a common access card and know a password. After successful authentication, authorization validates what resources the user has access to based on a set of access control policies. Our authorization measures include principle of least privilege. You're only authorized to access the parts of the network you need in order to fulfill your job responsibilities, and separation of duties, the checks and balances to reduce the risk of insider threat so that one party cannot perform a malicious act and then also have the ability to monitor the network to cover it up. Access controls are the rules for how authorization policies are enforced. For role-based access control, the operations the user is allowed to access is based on their responsibility in the organization. As a team, we must identify the attack vector that allowed the secure communications network to be breached. Attack vectors are paths by which adversaries gain unauthorized access to systems or data. The common attack vectors we identified are hardware, through backdoors to gain root access on a system, and malware during the manufacturing process, like Trojans, installed to the hardware's firmware that trigger attacks once it's installed. Software, through SQL injection or cross-site scripting. Operating systems, through buffer overflows that can cause the system to crash or execute malicious code. Telecommunication, through man-in-the-middle attacks by tapping into the network cable, collecting wireless traffic, or redirecting traffic to another location. And human attack vectors, like malicious insiders. They can use weak credentials that can be susceptible to brute force or dictionary attacks, a misconfiguration of the settings that do not comply with the industry security standards, and social engineering like phishing schemes when an adversary poses as a trustworthy source to send a fraudulent email with hopes that a user will reveal personal information voluntarily. We mapped the current risks to the most critical vulnerabilities based on current threats and attack vectors. Vulnerabilities are an exploitable weakness that could lead to a security breach. Threats are an action that can exploit a vulnerability and cause damage. And risks are the susceptibility that a vulnerability could expose data to threats and a loss would occur. Here you can see how certain vulnerabilities are able to exploit the network through the attack vectors we mentioned. Because we have reason to believe this attack could be occurring from the inside, we placed human attack vectors as the highest threat to be mitigated, as our predetermined defensive controls can provide adequate protection against those categorized as lower risks. Based on the extensive vulnerability assessment matrix, we categorized the vulnerabilities to articulate 3 types of security weaknesses: people, technology, and policy. For New Zealand specifically, we need to consider the risks involved with unpatched software, employee training, security policy enforcement, database controls, asset management, log review and analysis, encryption, weak credentials, and a lack of redundant storage. This chart further categorizes the most vulnerable assets based on the current threats, attack vectors, security weaknesses, and pre-mitigated defensive measures that we covered in the previous slides. Based on the factors identified in the assessment, the assets most vulnerable to specific threats are prioritized. When determining the quantitative formula for prioritizing risk, we evaluated the economic impact multiplied by the probability of a threat event occurring. The impact factors could include technical consequences, such as the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, or business consequences like financial damages, legal implications, or policy noncompliance due to data breaches. Risks that cannot be avoided, shared, or transferred must be mitigated or accepted by the organization. Due to resource and budget constraints, it's not reasonable to be able to mitigate every risk. Due to security concerns, accepting all risks is also not an option. The risk assessment classifies the likelihood that a threat could cause a level of damage that would meet the threshold for mitigation. Because of this, the high and medium threats on the chart should be mitigated by the following. Automated patch management. Some assets will have inherent risks that cannot be avoided, like software vulnerabilities. Attempting to avoid these completely by switching software will continue to impact spending by the government while minimizing productivity by having to shift resources and still incurring risk of vulnerabilities being discovered in the new software. Centralized logging. Logs are another essential asset that pose the risk of undiscovered breaches or anomalous behavior if policies allow for insufficient review and analysis, or malicious actors are able to cover their tracks. Employee training. Training programs should identify best practices, including operational security protocols, password management, being cognizant of emails from unknown senders, and not opening certain attachments that seem out of place in order to avoid malware insertion or malicious actors gaining a foothold into the network. Firewall configurations. Social engineering attacks could open the door for unauthorized access, allowing the malicious actors to insert the malware or pivot through the organization's intranet. And finally, encryption protocols need to be mitigated. Unprotected clear text data formats or utilizing obsolete cryptography could lead to a data breach or loss of confidentiality. It is recommended that the final set of assets accept or avoid the probability of a low to moderate risk factor. Certain vulnerabilities like access control, asset management, and domain controllers have already been mitigated by the defensive measures that New Zealand has in place, lowering the probability of the occurrence and minimizing the amount of risk that the organization needs to accept. Some of the industry best practices that are identified are mitigations that New Zealand are. In conclusion, an analysis of the prioritized list of risk responses provides a clear picture for leadership to move to the risk management implementation planning by ensuring that the technical, policy, and personnel mitigation strategies are properly resourced. Maintaining a line of communication with the other nations regarding the identification of vulnerabilities and possible attack vectors is imperative to identify the adversary behind the attack. Information sharing facilitates better collaboration, which in turn will strengthen the security infrastructure for the Global Economic Summit and ensure another attack does not occur.